Welcome back to the Vibrational Stage Podcast, the place where we move beyond strategies, productivity, and performance to explore the deeper awareness that quietly shapes every experience we have. If you're joining me for the first time, welcome. If you've been walking alongside us throughout this week's exploration, thank you for being here. This week, we've been sitting with a question that many successful professionals eventually find themselves asking, often in the quiet moments between meetings, accomplishments, and responsibilities. I don't know what matters anymore. Now, on the surface, that can sound like a problem of priorities. It can sound like poor time management. It can sound like burnout, or perhaps even a lack of motivation. But throughout this week, we've been discovering that this experience is rarely about any of those things. Instead, it often points towards something much deeper. Because before we can discover what truly matters, we may first have to recognize that much of what we spend our lives pursuing wasn't consciously chosen at all. It was inherited. The difference between the two podcasts. Before we continue, I'd like to briefly explain something for those who may be new to the VibeShift ecosystem. Each week we explore one core problem through 3 different experiences. On the VibeShift podcast, we focus on practical transformation. That's where we examine the everyday experience of the problem. We explore recognizable patterns, practical awareness, and small shifts that begin changing how we experience our daily lives. Here on the Vibrational Stage Podcast, we take an entirely different approach. We ask a deeper question. Rather than asking, how do I solve this problem, we ask, what is creating this experience in the first place? Because lasting transformation rarely comes from simply changing our behaviors. It comes from seeing ourselves and our experiences of life with greater clarity. And later this week, we bring both conversations together in one comprehensive VibeShift blog post. Beginning this week, we are introducing a new rhythm for our community. Instead of publishing multiple blog posts throughout the week, we're now publishing one rich integration article every Friday. This weekly article will bring together the practical insights from the VibeShift podcast and the deeper awareness explored here on the Vibrational Stage podcast, creating one complete exploration of this week's core problem. Think of it as a place where the entire week's journey comes together. A quiet recognition. I'd like to begin today with a recognition. Not a teaching, not a philosophy, simply something you may recognize inside your own experience. Imagine someone looking at your life from the outside. They would probably see someone who has accomplished a great deal, someone who is responsible, someone who's dependable, someone who has built a career, someone who's shown up for family, someone who has carried enormous responsibilities, someone who has survived difficult seasons, someone who has continued moving forward even when life became incredibly challenging. From the outside, your life might look remarkably successful, and yet, inside, something has begun asking questions that success itself cannot answer. Questions like, why doesn't this feel the way I thought it would? Why do I keep accomplishing things only to immediately move to the finish line? Why does everything feel important but nothing feels deeply meaningful? How did I become so busy building a life that I forgot to ask whether it actually feels like mine? If you've ever found yourself quietly asking those questions, I want you to know something. You're not broken. You're not failing. And you're certainly not alone. In many ways, those questions are signs of awakening. Not awakening in a mystical sense, awakening in the very practical realization that achievement alone cannot answer questions that belong to awareness. The executive mind. Many of you listening are executives, leaders, business owners, healthcare professionals, entrepreneurs, managers, people whose daily lives revolve around making decisions that affect other people. You're exceptionally good at solving problems. You've learned how to organize complexity. You've become skilled at navigating uncertainty. People come to you because you create clarity. But there's another challenge that even the most capable leaders eventually encounter. The mind that excels at solving external problems often assumes that every internal experience can be solved the same way. So when life begins feeling disconnected, we create another plan. When meaning begins fading, we create another goal. When purpose feels uncertain, we look to another achievement. We're incredibly effective at improving our circumstances, but improving circumstances and understanding ourselves are not the same thing. And that's where today's conversation begins. The most important question you may never have been asked. I want to ask you something. When was the last time you stopped long enough to ask yourself, how did I come to believe that this was what matters? Not what matters, but how did I arrive at this definition in the first place? Because those are two entirely different questions. Most of us spend our lives trying to become better at living according to our values. Far fewer of us even pause long enough to investigate where those values came from. Who introduced them? Who reinforced them? Who rewarded them? Who celebrated them? Who quietly suggested that this is what a successful life should look like? It's one of the most important questions we can ever ask. Because until we understand where our definitions originated, it almost is impossible to know whether they are actually ours. The story that builds us. The fascinating thing about being human is that none of us begin life with a fully formed identity. We're born into stories. Stories about success. Stories about failure. Stories about work. Stories about love. Stories about responsibility. Stories about money. Stories about spirituality. Stories about happiness. Stories about what it means to be enough. Some of those stories are spoken out loud. Others are never verbalized. They're simply modeled every day. Perhaps your parents rarely rested. Perhaps achievement was celebrated while emotional honesty was quietly overlooked. Perhaps love felt connected to performance. Perhaps mistakes felt dangerous. Perhaps being dependable became the way you earned acceptance. Perhaps your family taught you that success meant sacrificing yourself. Or perhaps they taught you that your worth depended upon how useful you were to everyone else. None of these messages had to be intentionally taught. Children learn far more from observation than instruction. By the time we become adults, many of these stories no longer sound like someone else's voice. They sound like our own. When borrowed beliefs become personal truth. This is where something remarkable happens. The beliefs we've inherited slowly stop feeling inherited. They become invisible. Instead of saying, I learned that successful people should always be productive, we simply say, I should always be productive. Instead of recognizing my culture taught me that my career defines my value, we begin believing my career determines my value. The stories disappear. Only the conclusions remain. And because the conclusion feels like me, we rarely question it. We simply continue living from it for years, sometimes decades, until one day something begins feeling profoundly out of alignment. Not because life suddenly changed, but because awareness has quietly begun asking the question that conditioned mind never thought to ask. Is this actually true? The beginning of freedom. That question can feel unsettling. In fact, it often does, because if the beliefs that have guided your life aren't entirely your own, what else might not be? It's tempting to avoid that question, to become busier, to pursue another promotion, another project, another accomplishment, another goal, anything that allows us to keep moving instead of looking. But what if the moment of uncertainty isn't something to fear? What if it's actually an invitation? An invitation to discover that belief, every expectation, beneath every role, beneath every accomplishment, beneath every inherited definition of success, there has always been something quietly present. Something that has never needed to prove itself. Never needed another title. Never needed another achievement. Never needed anyone else's approval to know its own worth. That quiet presence is where we'll continue our exploration in part 2. Because before we can rediscover what truly matters, we first have to understand how the voices of family, culture, achievement, and expectation gradually became the voice we now call our own. Part 2. The Invisible Architecture of Identity. When conditioning becomes invisible. Welcome back. At the end of part 1, I left you with a question that I believe sits at the heart of this week's exploration. How did the voice inside your head become the voice you trust the most? It's an unusual question because most of us assume the voice in our heads is simply us. We assume that our preferences are our own, that our ambitions are our own, that our definitions of success are our own, that the standards we hold ourselves to naturally emerge from who we are. But what if much of what we call myself is actually an accumulation of influences that we've never consciously examined? This isn't about blaming our parents or society or our profession. Every generation inherits wisdom from the generations before it. That is part of being human. The deeper question is whether we've ever paused long enough to distinguish what was inherited from what is authentically ours. Because if we never make that distinction, we can spend decades faithfully serving goals we never consciously chose. Success can become an identity instead of an experience. High-performing professionals rarely pursue excellence because they simply enjoy doing good work, at least not forever. Somewhere along the journey, excellence often becomes something much heavier. It becomes identity. The promotion no longer feels like recognition, it feels like proof. The title no longer reflects your role, it reflects your worth. The successful quarter no longer celebrates your team's work, it reassures you that you're still enough. Do you notice how subtle that shift is? Achievement moves from something you experience to something you depend on. That's why accomplishment often feels surprisingly temporary. You finally reach the milestone you've been chasing. You celebrate it for a moment, and then almost immediately your mind asks, what's next? Not because you're ungrateful, because identity can never rest. If your value depends upon continuing to achieve, then every accomplishment becomes yesterday's evidence. Tomorrow still has to be earned. That is an exhausting way to live. Not because achievement is wrong, but because no external achievement can permanently stabilize an identity built on performance. The quiet performance that never ends. Many people think performance happens in the boardroom, or on the stage, or during presentations. But some of the most exhausting performances never happen in public. They're internal. The performance of always appearing strong, always having the answer, always being composed, always being dependable, always being productive, always being available, always being needed. Somewhere along the way, many successful people stop asking, "Who am I?" and begin asking, "Who do I need to be in order to deserve belonging?" That question changes everything, because now your life becomes organized around maintaining an image instead of discovering yourself. And here's the difficult part. The image may be extraordinarily successful. Other people may admire it, respect it, even aspire to become it. But inside, you may quietly feel farther and farther away from yourself. Not because you've become someone else, but because you've spent so long performing that you've forgotten what it feels like to stop. The stories we never realized we believed. Let's slow down for a moment. Imagine that I handed you a notebook. Inside that notebook are all the unconscious beliefs that quietly guide your life. Some of them might read like this: rest must be earned. My value comes from being useful. If I disappoint people, I lose their respect. Being busy means I'm important. If I'm not growing, I'm falling behind. I should always know what I'm doing. Strong people don't ask for help. My career defines who I am. Everyone else's needs come before mine. Now ask yourself something. Which of those statements are universal truths? And which are simply stories that have been repeated often enough to feel like truth? Most of us never question them because they have become the background operating system of our lives. We don't notice them in the same way a fish doesn't notice the water until something disrupts the pattern. Burnout, loss, retirement, illness, a career transition, an unexpected failure, or even success itself. Sometimes success creates enough space for us to realize that we've been climbing a ladder without ever asking whether it's leaning up against the right wall. When the executive mind meets the limits of control. This is where many high-performing professionals experience something deeply unsettling. For most of your career, you learn that difficult problems can be solved through better thinking, better planning, better execution, better systems, better leadership. Those skills are incredibly valuable. They're likely served you very well. But eventually you encounter a question that refuses to respond to strategy. What actually matters? You can't spreadsheet your way into meaning. You can't optimize your way into peace. You can't schedule authenticity. And you certainly cannot outperform an identity crisis. In fact, the more aggressively you chase these things, the more elusive they often become. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're unknowingly applied the tools of management to a question of awareness. Awareness does not emerge because we force it. It emerges because we become quiet enough to notice what has been present all along. The fear beneath the search. If we're being honest, many of us keep moving because we're afraid of what we might discover if we stop. What if I'm not who I thought I was? What if I've been chasing someone else's definition of success? What if the life I've built no longer reflects who I'm becoming? Those are frightening questions, not because they threaten our future, but because they challenge our identity. And the conditioned mind treats threats to identity the same way it treats threats to survival. It resists, it distracts, it rationalizes, it creates another project, another goal, another reason to stay busy. Anything except stillness, because stillness has a way of revealing things that constant activity keeps hidden. The quiet presence beneath the story. But here's the remarkable discovery. When people begin letting go of inherited identities, they often expect to feel empty. Instead, many begin describing something entirely different. A sense of spaciousness, relief, a feeling that they no longer have to keep proving themselves every moment of every day. Not because they've become less ambitious, but because ambition is no longer carrying the impossible burden of creating their worth. Imagine the difference. Instead of succeeding in order to become enough, you begin succeeding from the understanding that you already are. That shift transforms everything. Your work becomes an expression of who you really are rather than a negotiation for your value. Your leadership becomes less about image and more about presence. Your relationships become less about approval and more about connection. Your life becomes less about maintaining an identity and more about participating in the unfolding experience of being alive. Clarity is not what remains when noise settles. This brings us to what may be one of the most liberating realizations of today's conversation. Perhaps clarity has never been something we needed to create. Perhaps clarity has simply been obscured. Imagine standing beside a mountain lake. Someone stirs the water with a long pole. The lake becomes cloudy. You can't see the bottom anymore. How do you restore clarity? Do you force the water to become still? No. You simply stop disturbing it. Eventually, the sediment settles. The lake reveals what was there all along. This is such a powerful metaphor for our lives. The endless striving, the inherited expectations, the pressure to perform, the constant comparison, the relentless inner commentary. All of it keeps stirring the water of our awareness. And then we conclude that clarity has disappeared. But maybe clarity hasn't disappeared at all. Maybe it has simply been waiting beneath the turbulence, waiting for enough stillness to reveal itself. The invitation. As we conclude part 2, I'd like to leave you with a thought. If you've spent years measuring your life according to standards you inherited, it is completely understandable that you may no longer know what truly matters. The conclusion isn't evidence that you've lost your way. It may be evidence that you're finally becoming aware of the map you've been holding or following. And awareness changes everything, because once you can see the map, you no longer unconsciously are controlled by it. For the first time, you become free to ask a different question. Not what should my life look like, but what naturally begins to emerge when I stop trying to become someone I've never needed to become. That is where we'll go in part 3. As we bring together everything we've explored this week, introduce a practical awareness practice for executives, share an important update about the VibeShift ecosystem, and explore how you can continue this journey through the VibeShift solving process, including our newest guided experience, VSP number 4, I Don't Know What Matters Anymore. Part 3, returning to what has always been there. A different kind of success. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I'd like to offer you a possibility that may change the way you think about success altogether. Most of us spend our lives believing that clarity is something we achieve, that peace is something we earn, that meaning is something we discover after enough work, enough experience, enough wisdom, or enough success. But what if we've been looking in the wrong direction? What if clarity isn't something waiting for you somewhere in the future? What if it isn't hidden inside another promotion, another accomplishment, another certification, another financial milestone, or another perfectly executed plan? What if clarity has been quietly present all along? Covered over, but never absent. That possibility changes everything. Because now the work is no longer about becoming someone new. The work becomes remembering what has always been there beneath everything you've accomplished. The executive's greatest leadership challenge. Throughout my years as both a business owner and now through the conversations we have every week here at VibeShift, I've noticed something fascinating. The executives who experience the deepest transformation aren't necessarily those who become better managers. They become better observers. They begin noticing their own thinking. They begin recognizing when fear is making decisions instead of wisdom. They begin recognizing when they're reacting from inherited expectations instead of present awareness. They're beginning to recognize when they're saying yes because of guilt instead of genuine alignment. This is an entirely different level of leadership. It's leadership that begins within, because every external decision begins as an internal experience. If we're unconscious of that internal experience, our leadership becomes automatic. If we're aware of it, our leadership becomes intentional. And perhaps that's the leadership the world needs most right now. Not simply more productive leaders, more present leaders. Awareness does not remove responsibility. I also want to make something very clear. Nothing we've explored this week suggests that responsibility isn't important. In fact, quite the opposite. Awareness doesn't remove responsibility. It transforms our relationship with it. When we are living from inherited expectations, responsibilities often feel heavy. It feels like something we are carrying, something we're obligated to survive, something that slowly drains us. But when responsibility emerges from clarity, it feels entirely different. It becomes an expression of who we are, not proof of who we are. There's a profound difference between serving because we are afraid of not being enough and serving because generosity naturally arises from your deepest values. One contracts, the other expands. From the outside, the behaviors may appear almost identical. Internally, they are completely different. An awareness practice for the week. I'd like to leave you with an awareness practice that I believe can quietly begin changing the way you experience your life. Over the next several days, simply begin noticing your inner language. Whenever your mind says, I should, pause. Don't judge it. Don't argue with it. Don't immediately try to replace it with a better thought. Simply become curious. Ask yourself 4 questions. Who first taught me this? Is this actually true or simply familiar? Does living from the belief create expansion or contraction? If no one had ever taught me this, would I naturally choose this today? Notice that none of these questions require immediate answers. Their purpose isn't to solve anything. Their purpose is to create awareness, because awareness often begins transforming us long before we consciously decide to change. The power of gentle curiosity. One of the greatest gifts you can give yourself is permission to become curious instead of immediately becoming corrective. Many of us have spent years trying to fix ourselves, improve ourselves, optimize ourselves, heal ourselves, perfect ourselves. What if, for just 1 week, you replaced all of that with simple curiosity? Not how do I become a better version of myself, but what am I beginning to notice that I couldn't see before? Transformation often arrives much more quietly than we expect. Sometimes it begins not by changing your life, but with seeing your life differently. The new rhythm of the VibeShift ecosystem. Before we close today, I'd like to share an exciting update about the VibeShift ecosystem. Beginning this week, we're introducing a new weekly rhythm designed to create a more complete transformational experience. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we'll continue exploring one core problem through the 2 podcasts. On the VibeShift podcast, we focus on the practical experience, recognizing the pattern we've lived every day and introducing practical shifts that help us move toward greater clarity. Here on the Vybrational Stage Podcast, we explore the deeper architecture beneath those experiences. We ask the questions that often remain hidden beneath productivity, performance, and external success. Then, instead of publishing multiple blog posts throughout the week, we'll now publish one comprehensive VibeShift blog article every Friday. This weekly article will weave together the insights from both the podcasts into one rich integration, offering practical applications, deeper reflections, and an opportunity to see this week's core problem as one complete journey rather than 3 separate conversations. If you've been following both podcasts, I think you're going to love this new format because it allows every week's exploration to build towards something larger than any one episode alone. Continue the journey with the VibeShift solving process. If today's conversation resonated with you, I also want to invite you to continue this work through the VibeShift solving process. While these podcast episodes introduce each week's core problem, the VibeShift solving process takes you much deeper through extended audio experiences and guided reflection journals designed to help you move from intellectual understanding into lived transformation. Currently, there are 4 guided experiences available. VSP number 1, when your mind pulls you into fear. If you've ever felt trapped by anxious thinking, catastrophic predictions, or a mind that constantly pulls you toward worst-case scenarios, this experience explores how our relationship with thought itself can begin to change. VSP number 2 is when everything feels like too much. Overwhelm isn't simply about having too much to do. Often it's about fragmented attention and the exhausting belief that everything deserves equal importance. This guided experience explores how awareness restores spaciousness, even when life remains full. VSP number 3 is I can't turn it off. Many high-performing professionals discover that work doesn't end when the workday ends. Their minds continue solving problems, replaying conversations, anticipating tomorrow, and carrying invisible pressure long after they've left the office. This experience explores why the mind continues running and what becomes possible when awareness replaces constant mental activity. And now our newest release, VSP number 4, I Don't Know What Matters Anymore. This 3-hour guided exploration brings together everything we've been uncovering throughout this week. Together we'll explore how identity is quietly shaped by achievement, family, culture, and professional success. Why inherited definitions of meaning often begin to feel empty. How awareness helps us distinguish borrowed priorities from authentic values. Why clarity isn't something we manufacture, but something that naturally emerges as conditioned thinking begins to quiet. And how to begin living from direct experience rather than inherited expectations. Each VibeShift solving process experience also includes a beautifully designed companion reflection journal to help you integrate these discoveries into your own life at your own pace. If today's episode opened a door for you, VSP number 4 was created to help you continue walking through it. This week's VibeShift blog. And don't forget that this week's journey continues in our Friday VibeShift blog. There we'll bring together everything we've explored throughout this week, from the practical conversations on the Vibe Shift podcast to the deeper awareness we've explored here on the Vibrational Stage podcast, and integrate them into one comprehensive article designed to help you begin living from what genuinely matters rather than what you've simply inherited. If you've enjoyed following the conversations throughout the week, I think you'll find the Friday blog to be the place where everything finally comes together. You can read it by following the link in the show notes. A final reflection. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Perhaps the person you've been trying so hard to become was never the point. Perhaps beneath every role you've played, every title you've earned, every expectation you've carried, every success you've achieved, every story you've inherited, there has always been something quietly waiting. Not another identity, not another version of yourself, not a future self that finally has everything figured out. Simply awareness. The quiet presence that notices every thought without becoming trapped inside it. The stillness that remains even while life continues changing. The part of you that existed before anyone told you what success should look like. Before anyone defined your worth. Before anyone handed you a script for how your life was supposed to unfold. That presence has never left. It has never been broken. It has never needed fixing. It has simply been waiting for enough space to be heard again. And perhaps, just perhaps, the clarity you've been searching for isn't waiting somewhere ahead of you. Perhaps it's been patiently waiting beneath everything you've been carrying. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next time, keep noticing, keep questioning the kindness, keep leading with kindness, keep leading with awareness, and above all, keep discovering that the deepest transformation doesn't come from becoming someone else. It comes from remembering who you were before the world convinced you that you needed to become anyone different.